Clara Harper had always prided herself on being a woman of logic and reason, her life built around facts and journalistic integrity. Ghosts, spirits, hauntings, they were the realm of fantasy, fiction at best. Yet here she was, standing before the looming figure of the RMS Queen Mary, the infamous ship said to be haunted by more than 100 restless souls. The air was thick with the scent of salt water and something else, something older and harder to place, like the scent of decay masked beneath layers of time. Clara stepped off the gangway, her breath catching slightly in her throat as she surveyed the ship's massive exterior. The Queen Mary was majestic, no doubt about that, its grand stature a relic of the past. Now permanently moored in Long Beach, it functioned as a floating hotel and tourist attraction, but its history was dark, far darker than most guests realized. She had been assigned to write a piece about ghost tourism for Travel Horizons, a job she had accepted without much thought. It was just another assignment, after all, another place to explore and debunk the myths surrounding it. The stories of the Queen Mary were well known, at least in paranormal circles. Apparitions of a ghostly child near the swimming pool, the shadowy presence of an engineer who died in the bowels of the ship, the sounds of phantom footsteps in the hallways. None of it rattled her. As she checked in at the front desk, the ship's strange atmosphere began to settle into her bones. There was something unnerving about the stillness, an unnatural quiet that seemed to press down on her, even in the bustle of the hotel lobby. The receptionist, a thin woman with hollow eyes and a strained smile, handed her the key to her cabin, room B340, a notorious room with a history of hauntings. Clara had requested it specifically, hoping to capture something strange for her article. But as the woman passed over the key, her fingers trembled slightly, and Clara could have sworn she saw a flash of something, fear, in her eyes. "Enjoy your stay," the receptionist said in a flat tone, but her voice lacked the warmth or sincerity of someone who truly meant it. Clara felt a cold prickle run up her spine, but she pushed the feeling away. It was probably nothing. Or it was exactly what she had come for, atmosphere, nothing more. The corridors of the Queen Mary were long and narrow, the polished wood paneling reflecting the dim lighting from above. As Clara made her way to her cabin, she noticed the faint creaking of the ship beneath her feet. It was as if the old vessel was groaning, stretching, still alive in some strange way. She passed a few other guests along the way, tourists with cameras slung around their necks, couples whispering to each other in hushed tones, but for the most part, the ship was eerily quiet. Room B340 was down a particularly dark hallway, tucked away in a corner of the ship that felt forgotten. The door was heavy, the brass handle cooled to the touch. As she turned the key and pushed it open, a rush of cold air greeted her. The room was modest but comfortable. A queen-sized bed, a small desk, and a round porthole window that looked out over the harbor. Clara dropped her bag on the bed and set up her laptop, her mind already racing with the possibilities of the story she could write. She had the evening to explore the ship before meeting up with the small group of other ghost hunters who were staying aboard. According to the schedule, there would be a group investigation of the swimming pool area later that night, where many had reported seeing the ghost of a young girl named Jackie. Clara had done her research. Jackie's story was one of the most famous hauntings on the Queen Mary. The little girl had supposedly drowned in the pool in the 1930s, and ever since, guests had claimed to hear her laughter or see her small, wet footprints leading from the edge of the pool. Clara shook her head, amused at how much people believed in these ghost stories. There had to be logical explanations for everything. As she unpacked her things, she heard a knock at the door.
Surprised, she opened it to find Luke, a photographer who had been hired by the magazine to accompany her on this assignment. He flashed her a grin, his camera slung lazily over his shoulder. "You ready for tonight? I heard some people have seen some crazy stuff around the pool," Luke said with a wink, but Clara could see the skepticism in his eyes. He wasn't any more of a believer than she was.
"We'll see," she said, smiling. "I'm not holding my breath." Luke gave a chuckle, but there was something about his demeanor that made her uneasy. Maybe it was the way his eyes darted down the hallway before he spoke again, lowering his voice. "Madison's here too, you know. The medium." Clara stiffened. She had heard about Madison, self-proclaimed psychic medium with a track record of spooking even the most skeptical guests. Clara wasn't keen on that sort of theatrics. "Great," she said, her tone flat. "Just what we need." Luke shrugged, clearly unfazed. "I think it adds to the atmosphere. People want to believe, right? Let's give them a show." As he left, Clara felt that prickle of unease return. The Queen Mary was just a ship, a floating relic with a rich history and some exaggerated ghost stories. But something about it was starting to unsettle her. The stillness of the ship, the way the light seemed to fade too quickly in the hallways, the way the air felt heavier the deeper into the ship she went. It was all playing tricks on her mind. Or was it? Nightfall came swiftly. Clara found herself standing outside the entrance to the first-class swimming pool, the air around her suddenly thick with the scent of chlorine, despite the pool being dry for decades. A group had gathered, Luke, Madison, and a few curious tourists, hoping to witness something paranormal. The pool itself was vast, the tiles cracked and faded, the once luxurious deck now crumbling. The stillness was oppressive, as though the room held its breath, waiting for something. Madison stood at the edge of the pool, her eyes closed, arms outstretched, murmuring under her breath. Clara rolled her eyes, but felt an involuntary shiver run through her body. She stepped closer to the pool's edge, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the cavernous room. It was colder here than it had been elsewhere on the ship, and she could see her breath misting in front of her. Suddenly, a soft giggle echoed through the air. Clara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. It was faint, distant, but unmistakably the sound of a child's laughter. She turned to Luke, who looked just as startled as she felt. "Did you—" Before she could finish her sentence, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Small, wet footprints were appearing on the edge of the pool, one after the other, as if an invisible child was walking toward them. The room, which had been silent moments before, seemed to hum with an unseen energy. Clara's skepticism faltered, and for the first time she felt the weight of fear settle in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, the stories were more than just stories. Maybe there was something here, something old and malevolent, waiting in the shadows of the Queen Mary, and maybe it had just found her. The days on the Queen Mary were starting to blur. Clara no longer kept track of how long she had been aboard. Time itself seemed to warp within the ship, each hour bleeding into the next, as if the ship had its own rhythm, its own pulse. What started as a straightforward assignment had devolved into something darker, something Clara couldn't fully explain, and didn't want to. It wasn't just that strange things were happening. It was that the ship had begun to feel alive. The nights were the worst. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the ship sinking around her, felt cold water creeping up her ankles as if it were trying to pull her under. When she jolted awake, gasping for air, the room was still, silent, except for the creaking of the ship, those deep groans of old wood and metal that never seemed to stop, as though the Queen Mary was restless, dissatisfied, still straining against something unseen. And then there were the dreams. Each night they came, drowning, burning, falling into a darkness so deep it had weight. She dreamed of the pool, its cracked tiles, its long, empty deck, and of a girl standing at the water's edge, her back to Clara, dripping wet. In the dream, Clara would reach out, but the girl would always vanish just as her fingers brushed the air. Always she woke before she could see the child's face. But the dreams weren't the only things slipping out of her control. The ship itself seemed to shift. The layout no longer made sense. Hallways that once led to the ballroom twisted into dead ends, and stairwells seemed to spiral on forever. The corridors stretched longer than they should, leading Clara to unfamiliar, shadowed parts of the ship that weren't on any map. Once, she found herself in an engine room, though she hadn't taken any stairs to get there. The air had smelled of oil and decay, and the oppressive heat had made her skin slick with sweat. But when she tried to retrace her steps, she found only empty corridors and locked doors. The Queen Mary had a mind of its own, it seemed, and it was toying with her. On the third night, Luke disappeared. Clara had knocked on his cabin door, but no one had answered. She had waited, listening for movement inside, but there was nothing. After some time, she asked the staff, but they said he hadn't been seen all day. His camera bag was still in his room, untouched. The sheets were still rumpled, and his luggage was in the corner, half-packed. Clara had the unnerving sense that Luke hadn't left of his own accord. Her unease deepened when she retrieved his camera, hoping to find some clue as to where he had gone. As she clicked through the photos, her pulse quickened. The images were wrong. At first, they were of the usual, artsy shots of the ship's decks, black and white portraits of the other guests. But then, the photos shifted. Dark shadows crept into the frames, shapes that didn't belong. Blurred figures stood at the edges of hallways, figures that hadn't been there when the photo was taken. Clara could feel a chill gathering at the base of her neck as she clicked through the images faster, her hands trembling. Then, she saw it. One of the last pictures Luke had taken was of him in the mirror, in the hallway near the pool. But in the reflection, standing just behind him, was the Gray Lady. Her face, pale and distorted, stared back from the glass, her eyes black pits. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The photo blurred as her vision swam, but the image burned into her mind. The Gray Lady, as if she had been waiting behind Luke all along. The ship had taken him. That night, Clara met with Madison in the ship's darkened lounge. The medium had been more and more erratic over the past few days. Her pale skin had taken on a sickly gray hue, and her eyes darted constantly to the shadows, as if something was following her just out of sight. She was speaking faster now, her voice low and urgent. "They're not just spirits," Madison said, her eyes wide with fear. "There's something else, something older, darker. This ship, it's feeding on us. It knows we're here. It wants us." Clara frowned, trying to keep her voice steady. "What are you talking about? These are just stories, Madison. Ghosts. Maybe Luke just left." "No!" Madison interrupted, her voice sharp and desperate. "You don't understand. I've spoken to them. The ones who are trapped here. They can't leave. And neither can we. The ship, it won't let us go." Clara stared at her, trying to make sense of the words, but they clung to her like cobwebs, sticking in her mind despite her attempts to brush them away. The room felt too warm, too thick, like the walls were pressing in. "Clara," Madison's voice dropped to a whisper. "I saw Luke. He's gone. The ship has him now. It's hungry." Clara felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. Her hands trembled as she clenched them into fists beneath the table, trying to ground herself. "That's insane," she whispered. "It's just a ship, Madison. It's just an old ship." But even as she said it, she didn't believe it. The ship's strange creaks and groans seemed to echo her fear, mocking her denial. "You need to leave," Madison continued, her eyes flicking toward the shadows again. "But it's too late for me." The Queen Mary's once grand hallways felt even more twisted now, the walls narrowing around Clara as she moved through the ship. The sense of being watched, of something following her, had grown unbearable. Every sound, every whisper of air, every creak felt like it carried some sinister meaning. She tried to keep her thoughts rational, but the edges of her mind were fraying, unraveling. She wasn't sleeping anymore. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them. The ghosts, faces in the walls, hands reaching out from the mirrors. She started seeing Luke in the reflections, his eyes hollow, his mouth open in a silent scream. The gray lady followed her everywhere, her face always just out of view, lurking at the corners of Clara's vision. Then the footsteps began. At night, in the hallway outside her cabin, she heard them, slow, deliberate, heavy footfalls. Every night the sound came closer. Every night they stopped just outside her door, but no one was ever there. Clara tried to focus on her work, to anchor herself in something solid. She pored over old logs, journal entries, and crew manifests she had found in the ship's archive room, hoping to find some rational explanation for what was happening. But the deeper she dug, the worse it got. She uncovered old reports from the Queen Mary's time as a troop ship during the war. There were mentions of strange occurrences during its crossings, missing men, accidents, unexplained deaths. More than a few were listed as suicides, but Clara could sense the undercurrent of something more, something the crew hadn't spoken about openly. Her research led her to the Curacoa disaster, where the Queen Mary had accidentally sliced through the HMS Curacoa, killing hundreds of men. Many of their bodies were never recovered, lost to the cold Atlantic depths. Clara had the horrible feeling that the ship carried their ghosts, and that they had never left. It was all coming undone. The ship, her mind, the walls between reality and nightmare. Clara began to see shadows even in the daylight, ghostly figures flitting through the hallways, vanishing just as quickly as they appeared. But the worst was the pool. She couldn't stop dreaming about it. The little girl, Jackie, standing there, dripping water onto the cracked tiles. In the dreams, Clara would reach out for her, and just before she could touch her, Jackie would turn. And her face would be twisted, drowned, her eyes wide and unseeing. Clara was slipping, and deep down, she knew it. But the ship wasn't done with her yet. The descent had only just begun. Clara's grip on reality was slipping fast, and she knew it. The Queen Mary had her now. It had all of them. Its guests, its crew, even the ghosts who wandered the halls like prisoners. The ship breathed with a life of its own, and the deeper Clara sank into its labyrinthine passages, the more she felt it feeding on her fear, her confusion, her very essence. Luke was still missing, or maybe he wasn't. Clara couldn't tell anymore. Sometimes she thought she saw him out of the corner of her eye, standing at the end of a corridor, his camera slung over his shoulder, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. But when she blinked, he was gone, swallowed by the ship. The others, those few guests who had remained aboard, spoke in hushed tones now, their eyes wide with an unspoken understanding. No one wanted to admit it, but they all felt the same thing. Something was wrong with the Queen Mary. Madison had locked herself in her room. No one had seen her in days, and Clara was beginning to wonder if she was still alive. The last time they had spoken, Madison had been a shaking, paranoid wreck, muttering about how the ship had been waiting for them, how it was ancient, how it was feeding on them, one by one. Clara had wanted to believe it was just a psychological breakdown, a result of Madison's sensitivity to the supernatural. But now Clara wasn't so sure. Clara's nights were sleepless, her days lost in a haze of disorientation. She wandered the ship's endless halls, her footsteps echoing in the hollow stillness. But no matter how far she walked, she always seemed to end up back where she started. The ship was twisting in on itself, warping its interior like some sick game, and Clara was its puppet. Sometimes she would walk into a room that should have been familiar, only to find the walls had changed, the doors had moved. The Queen Mary was shifting, reshaping itself around her, trapping her in its belly. Then there were the voices. At first, they were faint, whispers just out of earshot, like the murmurs of a distant conversation. But soon they became louder, clearer. They called her name, beckoning her deeper into the ship's hidden depths. Clara had followed them once, down into the bowels of the ship, where the air was thick with the stench of oil and rust, where the metal walls seemed to close in on her. She had wandered for hours, hearing the faint hum of machinery, the groan of the old engine that had long since gone silent. There, deep in the engine room, she thought she had seen Luke again. He had stood at the far end of the room, motionless, his back to her. Clara had called his name, but he hadn't turned. He hadn't moved at all. She had approached slowly, her breath shallow, her pulse thrumming in her ears, but something about the way he stood there, so still, so silent, had made her stop just short of touching him. When she finally forced herself to reach out, her hand met nothing but cold air. He was gone, a shadow, a trick of the mind. But the shadows were getting stronger. On the fifth night, the footsteps returned. Those slow, heavy footfalls that echoed in the hall outside her cabin, growing closer and closer. Clara had tried to ignore them at first, rationalizing that it was just the sound of the ship settling, just the normal groans of an old structure. But when the footsteps stopped outside her door, her heart froze in her chest. It was the same every night now. The footsteps, always stopping just beyond the threshold. She never opened the door. Not anymore. But tonight was different. Tonight, the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, moving through the door as if it wasn't even there. She felt it before she saw it. The temperature in the room plummeted, her breath visible in the dim light. Clara lay still, her body paralyzed with fear as the cold crept over her like a shroud. She heard the creak of the floorboards, the slow drag of something moving closer to her bed. Her eyes flicked to the foot of the bed, and there in the darkness she saw it, a shape, indistinct, hunched, like a shadow peeled away from the wall, now standing at the edge of her bed, watching her. For a long moment, nothing happened. It just stood there, a black void, featureless, without form, but somehow more real than anything she had ever seen. Then it began to move toward her, slow and deliberate. Clara wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but she couldn't. Her body was frozen, locked in place by an invisible force. The shadow loomed over her, its presence pressing down on her chest, suffocating, until her vision blurred at the edges, and she felt herself slipping into unconsciousness. When she woke, the room was empty, and the shadow was gone. But the terror lingered. Clara wasn't the only one falling apart. Officer Henderson, the retired naval officer who had taken it upon himself to protect the few remaining guests, was starting to crack. He had always been stoic, solid, but now his eyes were wild, his hands shaking as he gripped his flashlight like a lifeline. Clara found him one evening in the ship's ballroom, sitting alone at the grand piano, his fingers hovering over the keys. But he wasn't playing. He was listening. "The ship," he whispered when Clara approached. "It talks. I can hear it now." Clara sat beside him, her heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" Henderson turned to her, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. "I was on this ship during her last voyage," he said quietly, "when we decommissioned her. I was just a kid then, barely out of the academy. We heard things, saw things, but we never talked about it. We couldn't. And now I'm back, and it's like it's waiting for me." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Waiting for what? Henderson's gaze shifted to the empty ballroom, his lips trembling. For the next soul. Clara wanted to dismiss him, to brush off his ramblings as the product of an overactive imagination, but she couldn't. Not anymore. The ship was alive. She could feel it. It was drawing them in, feeding on their fear, their despair. Luke had been the first. Madison was next. And now Henderson was slipping too, his mind unraveling like frayed rope. They were running out of time. The ship's corridors were darker now, the lights flickering erratically as though the ship was struggling to hold itself together. Clara moved quickly through the hallways, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness, but no matter how fast she walked, she felt the weight of something following her, always just out of sight, always just behind her. It was in the mirrors now, too. Every time Clara passed a reflective surface, she saw it, a shadow moving just behind her, too quick to catch, but always there, lurking. Sometimes it was Luke. Sometimes it was the Gray Lady, but more often than not, it was something else, something darker, a presence that didn't belong to any ghost she had read about, something much older and more dangerous. The Queen Mary was hunting her. She tried to leave. Once, but every exit led her back inside. The gangway was gone. The doors to the outside world were locked, or worse, gone altogether. The ship had become a maze, and Clara was its prey. She knew deep down that there was no escape. The ship wouldn't let her leave. Not now, not after what she had seen. The Gray Lady had appeared to her again that night, standing in the ballroom, her face a mask of sorrow and something else, something like recognition. Clara had watched her from across the room, too afraid to move as the Gray Lady lifted her hand and pointed, her translucent finger leading Clara's gaze to a door on the far side of the room. A door that Clara hadn't noticed before. The ship was showing her something, or leading her into a trap. With no other choice, Clara followed. The door led to a part of the ship Clara had never seen before, a long, narrow corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were lined with photographs, old black and white images of the Queen Mary's past, its passengers, its crew, its time as a luxury liner, and then as a troop ship. But as Clara walked, the photographs began to change. The faces of the passengers were distorted, twisted into grotesque masks of pain and terror. The crew members stared back at her with hollow eyes, their mouths open in silent screams. At the end of the corridor, she found it. A door, rusted and heavy, with no handle. The metal was old, stained with something dark. Clara's heart raced as she approached, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the cold surface. Behind the door, she heard it. The whispers. The voices that had haunted her since the first night. But now they were louder, clearer, and they were calling her name. Clara knew with every fiber of her being that whatever lay behind that door would be the end of her. But she also knew she had no choice. The Queen Mary had brought her here for a reason, and now she had to see it through. Taking a deep breath, Clara pushed open the door and stepped into the darkness. The door groaned open, a slow, heavy sound that echoed through the dark corridor behind her. Clara stood at the threshold, her breath catching in her throat, as the cold air from within the hidden room rushed out, enveloping her like a shroud. The darkness beyond seemed thicker than before, more oppressive, like it had weight. There was no light inside, yet someone, was waiting for her in there. She could feel it. The whispers that had once haunted her had fallen silent. Now there was only the deep, unsettling thrum of the ship around her. The Queen Mary seemed to be holding its breath, as if the entire ship was waiting for her next step. Clara hesitated, every instinct telling her to turn back, to run. But it was too late for that. She had come too far. There was no way out now. With one final shallow breath, she stepped through the doorway. The room was cold, far colder than it should have been. Clara's skin prickled, her breath fogging in front of her as she moved further into the darkness. The door swung shut behind her with a soft click, sealing her inside. Panic flared in her chest, but she forced it down, steeling herself as her eyes adjusted to the dim light seeping in from somewhere unseen. The room was larger than she had expected, its walls high and lined with the same old metal that made up the bowels of the ship. But it wasn't the room that held her attention. It was the asterisks. They were standing in a loose circle, their faces turned toward her, their eyes wide and vacant. Ghosts. The very spirits that had haunted the ship for decades. Jackie, the drowned girl, with her dripping hair and pale skin. Officer Stark, whose chest was still marred by the wound that had killed him, and others, men and women from different eras, all staring at her with empty, pleading eyes. But it wasn't just them. There were others, people Clara recognized. Luke, standing off to the side, his face a mask of shock as though frozen in his last moments of terror. Madison, her hair wild, her hands clenched at her sides, her eyes full of unshed tears. And Officer Henderson, his proud uniform now ragged, his once strong frame hunched and defeated. All of them, together, trapped. They weren't ghosts, not yet. They were waiting. Clara's pulse quickened, her heart thundering in her chest. The ship wasn't just a vessel of the dead. It was a prison, a labyrinth of lost souls. And somehow she knew it was more than just the Queen Mary. This room, this moment, had always been waiting for her. The figure at the center of the room stepped forward, and Clara felt her blood turn to ice. It was the Grey Lady. Her pale gown fluttered softly in a non-existent breeze, her skin ghostly white, her eyes dark and hollow. But this time there was something different about her. She wasn't just an apparition. She felt real, solid, as if the distance between the living and the dead had collapsed. The Grey Lady raised a hand and gestured toward Clara, her voice soft, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You're the last." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "The last," she whispered, her voice trembling. The Grey Lady's hollow eyes locked onto hers. "You've seen the truth. The ship brought you here for a reason, just as it brought all of us. It feeds on us, it keeps us, binds us, and we can never leave. Not until it has what it needs." Clara shook her head, backing away. No, there has to be a way out. There has to be." "There isn't," the Grey Lady replied, her voice cold but filled with sorrow. "The ship chose you, Clara, just like it chose me, like it chose all of us. We are its prisoners now, forever." The word hit her like a physical blow. Forever. The weight of it was unbearable. Clara stumbled backward, her mind spinning, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The Queen Mary had lured her here, just like it had lured the others, feeding on their fear, their desperation, trapping them in its web. There was no escape. There never had been. And now, she was one of them. "No," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "No, I can't stay here. I can't." The Gray Lady stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, her pale hand reaching out toward Clara. "You don't have a choice," she said softly. "None of us did." Clara's eyes filled with tears, her mind screaming in denial. She had been so sure she could outsmart the ship, that she could uncover its secrets and walk away. But the truth had been here all along, waiting for her, woven into the ship's very bones. The Queen Mary didn't let go of its prey, but there was something else, something deeper, a realization that made Clara's heart stop in her chest. This had all been a cycle. The ship chose its victims one by one, dragging them into its world of darkness and despair. And the final piece of the puzzle, the final piece of the ship's twisted design, wasn't just for Clara to become another lost soul. It was for her to take her place, to become the next Gray Lady. The truth hit her like a wave, cold and brutal, drowning her. Clara staggered backward, the room spinning around her as the weight of the revelation crashed down. She had always been part of the Queen Mary's story. The ship had marked her from the moment she set foot on its deck. It had shown her the ghosts, the terror, the unraveling of reality, not to scare her, but to prepare her. She wasn't just a victim. She was the vessel. Clara gasped for air, tears streaming down her face as the Gray Lady stepped closer, her form flickering, fading in and out of focus. "It's your turn now," she whispered. "It's always been your turn." Clara's legs gave way and she fell to her knees, her mind shattering under the weight of the truth. The ship was alive, and it had chosen her. All of the spirits, all of the lost souls had been leading her here, to this moment. They weren't haunting the ship. They were part of it. And now, so was she. The Gray Lady knelt before her, placing a cold hand on Clara's cheek. The touch was gentle, but there was no comfort in it. "You'll stay with us now," she whispered. "Forever." Clara closed her eyes, her body trembling, her heart breaking under the weight of what she had become. There was no escape. There never had been. The Queen Mary had taken everything from her, her mind, her soul, her very existence. And now it had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many before. The last sound Clara heard before the darkness took her was the soft, haunting echo of the Gray Lady's voice, whispering through the endless corridors of the Queen Mary. "Welcome home." And then there was nothing. The Queen Mary waited, silent, eternal, ready for its next victim.